This video is looking at Head of English by Carol Ann Duffy. We're going to treat it as though you haven't done any study on the poem before, so if you have learned it in class for GCSE or any other examination, then just bear with me while I go through the basic bits, and then we'll get on to a more analytical approach later on in the video. So first of all, this is assuming that you've actually read the poem, and a copy of it, a clean copy of it, is available on the internet if you just Google. And we'd see immediately from the title that the title is a job title as well as the poem title, Head of English. And you probably know in school that there is somebody who is in charge of the English department and they are referred to as the Head of English. And I think straight away looking at this title, if you can see my notes up at the top, you get this kind of romanticised or idealised idea of the job versus the reality. So this is a poem where you'd think maybe that the Head of English, to have reached those sort of lofty heights, would be absolutely passionate and knowledgeable about all things literary. Whereas actually what we get is somebody who is really very limited in their outlook of both literature and their outlook of other human beings, apparently. And we can argue that they are sort of defined by their job title. We don't know explicitly anything else about them, but we can really infer quite a lot about their approach to their job, their approach to literature, their approach to their students by what they say in this dramatic monologue. Because we've got this first person speaker who is the Head of English, who is talking about a visiting poet. And I mean, I suppose there's also a kind of contrast or a kind of tension there that I've put the note, you can be head of English. You know, the idea that English is such a massive subject, someone can be in charge of it, seems a strange concept. But I'd make sure that you have a note on the title, that maybe the expectations of somebody whose job is to oversee the delivery of English in a school is kind of very different to the voice that we get here. And I put as well here that this is a satirical portrayal. So satire, and just put a note there, is that kind of pointed humour. It's humour with a sting, with a kind of barb to it, where you are actually making a point, a critical point, by making fun of the way that something is. And one of the things that's notable in this poem is that actually Duffy satirises the Head of English with his or her preferences for rhyming poetry by writing in free verse. So straight away, you know, she may profess, she may claim that she wants to listen to kind of rhymed poems or kind of express a sadness that not all poems rhyme these days, but her own poem, or the poem kind of encapsulating her, the poem kind of capturing her, is in free verse. Now, as we're going through this, I am going to assume that the Head of English is female. The Head of English could be male, okay? The only reason I'm doing that is, I suppose, because most of the heads of English I've known have been female. So I kind of default into that more easily than saying he, but you may pick the gender or indeed kind of use they if you prefer. So we start off with today we have a poet in the class. So it's a very simple, largely monosyllabic announcement. So, you know, drawing the attention to the fact that there is a visitor to school, a real live poet with a published book. So you start to get that repetition of poet, so emphasising the visitor's status. And again, somebody who is defined by their job title. And this is almost kind of Head of English versus poet in this poem. And between the kind of first mention of poet and the second mention, that type of repetition is called diacope, but you can say repetition. We have this elaboration of a real live poet. And we start to get this tone of it being slightly patronising. Now, if you patronise somebody, you talk down to them. So you are condescending, you are kind of speaking to them as if they were stupid or as if they were much younger. And this idea of a real life poet with a published book. Actually, if you think of how your teacher in school would hopefully introduce a poet, you'd get their name, would have done some research or some reading into their work before they arrived. They wouldn't just be kind of dropped in front of you with no background detail other than they've been published. And she moves into almost a kind of parody of a school trip where the teacher is imparting the information. So if you can imagine almost there at the zoo or so, and she's pointing out the animals when she says, notice the ink-stained fingers, girls. It's kind of like, notice the feathers, or notice the kind of, spots or the camouflage. It is being really patronising. And she continues with that idea of perhaps we're going to witness verse hot from the press. Now, if you think of the days when, well, I guess they still are, kind of newspapers being printed into physical copies, it would be said that they were hot from the press. I suppose the nearest we get now is really when if you get photocopies from your teacher and they're still warm because they've just come out of the photocopier and people put them against their faces. That happens a lot. But that idea of being hot from the press, being the latest kind of news, the latest scoop. But it's really kind of now a bit of a cliche, and it's kind of a little bit outdated. And, it's setting the poet up as somebody who is performing, almost like kind of performing tricks, like some sort of circus animal. Look at this, look at the ink-stained fingers, look at the fingers with ink blots on them. Maybe we're going to see this poet write something. So it's really devaluing the poet's work and the idea that they could just come in and perform, could write some poetry immediately for this class. Who knows? Kind of undermines that again. It's almost kind of in line with who cares. Please show your appreciation by clapping, not too loud. So we have this kind of idea of control and decorum. So decorum is the kind of expected thing that's meant to happen. But this teacher wants to keep a tight hold of the classroom. So, if they say, please applaud and people are daft, then you get that kind of, yes, that's enough kind of sentiment. Now sit up straight and listen. So she's very much in teacher mode. So these imperatives, so teacher type instructions, are dealing with the expected business of the classroom. Now we kind of get the next instruction, so the next imperative. Remember the lesson on assonance. Now, assonance is repetition of a vowel sound, and it's quite a niche kind of little bit of the alliteration family, or the kind of sound effects family. And the fact that she's going in for this minute detail is again creating that sense of devaluing what they're about to hear. Because she's saying you'll have to remember about assonance because this poet, her poems, or the poet's poems, don't rhyme. And the teacher, the head of English, expresses some sadness from that kind of adverb sadly about this. So she's saying, remember about assonance because not all poems rhyme these days, as if it's a shame. So you're not going to be able to look at rhyme because these poems won't rhyme. They will be in free verse. And this is bringing us back to this point up here about Duffy using free verse to satirise the head of English who prefers her poems to rhyme. And we can infer quite a lot about the head of English from this idea. So first of all, there is regret. She thinks that proper poems should rhyme. And these days, so she is trapped in some old kind of more traditional view of what poetry properly should be. And that is, rhyming. So we're getting this idea of control, that she prefers her poems to rhyme. She tries to control her students. She's certainly controlling how much information they're getting about this poet. But we get still, never mind. So again, kind of dismissing everything that this poet stands for, really. A reminder of the school rules, whispering's as always out of bounds. So, out of bounds is forbidden, but do feel free to raise some questions. So again, the kind of idea of feel free is not as important as, make sure you ask questions. So she's kind of not ordering them to ask questions, but is suggesting that they can. But the reasoning for that is, after all, we're paying £40. So it's this sense of wanting to get her money's worth from this visiting poet, with the implication that she thinks actually this is quite a high price to pay for a short visit to a school. You'll also notice that for the first time, really, we get this full rhyme here, bounds and pounds, almost to kind of make fun of her or to satirise her, the idea of rhyming. It's out of bounds. Feel free to raise questions. After all, we're paying £40. So she's falling back into her predictable, preferred, controlled way of addressing the world. Then, each time it seems that she is about to start doing something, or she's about to hand over to the poet, she finds other things to say or other things to tell them. So those of you with English second language, see me after break. And again, there's this kind of patronising and devaluing approach to the students as well, because with that announcement, she is automatically assuming, we think, that anybody whose first language is not English is not going to be able to understand. And we kind of assume that she's going to kind of drag them all in and explain what she thinks it was about. Then back to the welcome. We're fortunate to have this person in our midst. It's very general, very generic. Generic kind of is a way of saying non-specific. Okay, very general. And if you think, again, how your teacher would tend to introduce a visiting speaker, we say, we're incredibly lucky to have this person who has written, who has overseen, who has done. You'd get all the detail. Whereas actually we're fortunate, so understatement, to have this person in our midst. Not even to have them talking to you or to have them reciting poetry or say, just here, we're fortunate, we're quite lucky to have this person here. It's all underwhelming. And this next bit is an allusion. She's quoting Keats' poem To Autumn. Okay, now I've put the apostrophe in there because it's Keats' poem To Autumn, or you could say she is quoting Keats and his poem To Autumn. Okay, and it's season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. It's the first line, and it's an incredibly famous poem. And first of all, I suppose she doesn't complete the quotation. So query, does she actually know it? She's dismissive of an incredibly famous and well, thought of and beloved poem in English, which you wouldn't expect the head of English to be doing. She is holding up Keats perhaps as her view of a traditional poet, completely missing the irony that actually Keats in his day was incredibly revolutionary and cutting edge. So she's kind of misunderstanding her own frame of reference. She doesn't kind of quite know what she's saying. She's just kind of dropping these words in to prove that she knows poetry. So on and so forth. And then I've written quite a bit of poetry myself and doing Kipling with the lower fourth. So that's kind of year 9. But you'd hate to think of what her poetry is and how she's managing to almost put herself on a level with this person, saying, I've written a bit of poetry and I can quote a bit of Keats and I'm teaching Kipling. And again, Kipling is a reference which really does kind of benefit you going into a little bit more detail about, because Kipling really did like rhyming poetry. He's also now got a reputation for being really very closely associated with the British Empire. So all of that white empiricism that is now viewed so critically and as so toxic, and kind of those views of the British Empire, etc., as being incredibly superior. It's leading to this picture of the head of English as somebody who is increasingly kind of bigoted, prejudiced, stuck in the past, who's not kind of open to any sort of liberal view or change, which is really the kind of opposite of what poetry should be. Poetry really should be kind of pushing boundaries and asking questions and challenging people But she sadly is completely kind of oblivious to all of that. And so far you can see that we've got a colloquial tone. Okay, she's adopted that kind of conversational idea. We said it's written in free verse. It's kind of very much kind of giving you an insight into her ideas and thinking, and the kind of use of end stopping and enjambment and caesura. So end stopping, any punctuation at the end of a line; enjambment, any time when your line is carrying on; caesura, any punctuation in the middle of a line. Is really kind of all contributing to that slightly fragmented, slightly disjointed, not fluent, critical tone that's developing. So make sure as you're going through that you've got ideas on form and structure, so that you're covering those. Okay, so again, we get this kind of false start. Right, that's enough from me, kind of handing over, on with the muse. Again, this allusion to kind of classical literature. Your muse was your inspiration, the thing or the person or the site or the experience or so that gave you your creativity, that inspired your ideas. Again, it's being used in a slightly kind of mocking way, I guess, that, she's now, after understating, she's now overstating what's happening. And yet she can't stop giving these instructions. Open a window at the back, kind of on with the poetry, open a window. So it's going from that kind of high classical reference to the practical side of things in a way that's almost involving kind of bathos. So bathos is that anticlimax where you go from something really high to something low. And then this comment, we don't want winds of change about the place. The winds of change comment is interesting because wind is a well-known metaphor for change and refreshing and blowing out kind of one set of the old kind of ideas and heralding a new set. And that is almost kind of like subconsciously, she is sticking with the old thoughts, the old authority, everything that she values and represents. We don't want things changing. We don't want any sort of revolution. We don't want any sort of challenge to everything she believes. And then the purpose, take notes but don't write reams. Again, lots and lots of instructions, lots and lots of imperatives of a classroom nature, and not particularly meaningful. We've gone from opening a window to take notes but don't write reams. A ream is a measure of paper. When you're photocopying, you get those kind of big packs of paper. That's a ream. So she's saying, take some notes, but don't write a lot. Surely the girls should be allowed to take whatever notes they want to. And then just an essay on the poet's themes. So the internal rhyme here, reams and themes, is making it all seem very kind of trite, making it all seem very superficial. It's kind of, don't take too many notes, you're just going to write an essay on it. And the essay is incredibly general. It's nothing, again, it's nothing specific, nothing that would indicate she's even bothered to read this person's work if she's just saying, write an essay on the poem's themes. Fine, off we go. And then the implication is that, she's finally about to allow the poet to speak. But then we get this kind of cutting, convince us that there's something we don't know. That tone of, you might be a poet, but I know everything there is to know about the way that poetry should be. And it's a challenge. It's a kind of pretty much a thinly veiled insult. You're not going to tell me anything I don't know, or if I don't know it, I'm not going to value it. And we have to assume that kind of at this point in the poem, the poet does his or her thing. And, the response of the head of English, well, really, run along now, girls. I'm sure that gave us an insight to an outside view. Again, very, very dismissive. Okay. So we have, there's no reflection, no invitation to ask questions, no praise, no real thanks. That comes at halfway through this final stanza. But, run along, girls is just basically teacher code for get out, isn't it? Off you go. And the idea of, I'm sure that gave an insight to an outside view. Insight is meant to be kind of when you get that real understanding of something. But she says, you gave us an understanding of an outside view, implying that actually this poet doesn't really know much about poetry, that they just have an outsider's view, that they are not part of this little club almost that the head of English views poetry as. Applause will do, like applause will suffice, applause is enough. We're not going to get this person a gift, for goodness sake. But again, it's very kind of patronising and borderline insulting. And she turns directly to the poet and says, "Thank you very much for coming here today. Lunch in the hall? Do hang about. Unfortunately, I have to dash." So this head of English doesn't have time, either literally or metaphorically, for this poet, because they're more than welcome to stay for lunch, but they won't be there. Okay, they are not going to be able to stay. It's not really a sincere invitation. It's an off-the-cuff kind of, hopefully you won't make it. And, unfortunately I have to dash. She also can't wait to get away from the poet. And we don't know who Tracy is. Tracy could be an adult, a kind of admin assistant, a teaching assistant, a secretary or receptionist or so. Tracy could also be a student, but whatever happens, the final lines of the poem are very definitely making the poet somebody else's responsibility, physically and metaphorically, as they are kind of escorted off the premises, having done the thing for which they've been paid £40. So if you're writing about this poem, I would make sure that you are talking about the creation of voice, that the key to this poem is really how Duffy portrays English teachers, or a specific type of English teacher, and by extension the approach to poetry in schools a lot of the time. Because Duffy is a cutting edge poet. She is doing all sorts of interesting and innovative things in poetry, and then is knowing that she is ironically being anthologised for GCSE and various other qualifications, where her work is being kind of pulled apart in a way that maybe she doesn't approve of. And in this poem, she is really capturing the idea that there are people out there whose job it is to unpick a poem, but who deliver that examination resentfully, or with prejudice, or with lack of passion, enthusiasm, or understanding. And it's that idea that we're looking at in this poem. So if you're answering, how does Duffy make this significant or effective, or, how does she create voice or character? It's all about inference. It's all about how she is giving us way more insight into this particular teacher's mindset, and what she is inviting you to conclude about that mindset, than it is actually kind of saying, this is a poem being presented. So I'd make sure that you've got your own ideas about how that satire, how that parody is achieved. Look at how the voice is created. Look at the stopping, the starting, the carrying on. Look at the cliche. Look at the understatement. Look at the thinly veiled insults. Look at the teacher's preferences. Keats, but the way she treats Keats's verse. Look at the idea of Kipling and everything he stands for. And above all, this head of English is teacher of the worst possible type, rather than lover of literature in the most passionate way. I hope this has given you some understanding and something to think about, and good luck with your studies.